Since Beethoven's birthday was last Wednesday, December 16th, I'd like to begin with two works by Beethoven. Beethoven was one of those composers who rarely had second thoughts. It seems he wrote all of his pieces, he worked really, really hard on them, and then they were done, and he went on to his next project and never looked back. Interestingly, all of his works are really incredibly, always really, really incredibly perfect structures. You can see why he never really needed to kind of like come back to them. But the piece that I'm going to begin today is an Allegretto in C minor. It's rarely played, and it was a rejected movement from one of his piano sonatas. Beethoven seems to have had these second thoughts mostly at times when his style was evolving and he was looking for something new in his writing. This is from the fifth piano sonata, or it was originally intended for the fifth piano sonata. The first four sonatas were big form movement structures, a big substantial fast first movement, a slow second movement that was kind of the emotional heart and soul of the piece. Then it was followed by kind of a lighter dance movement, often with a great deal of humor, and then there'd be a final big virtuosic last movement, just sort of a fun, varied piece that kind of just ties the whole thing together. So he wrote was working on his fifth piano sonata, wrote those first two movements, maybe a little bit more compact than the first two movements that there are in the first four sonatas. Then he wrote this third movement and then couldn't get anywhere on a fourth movement. And then he even rejected this one and wrote a different third movement and still couldn't get anywhere on the fourth movement. And then finally, what he ended up writing was just a single movement. It was kind of a hybrid third and fourth movement that had that sort of like humorous and humoristic quality that you find in his typical sort of dance third movements, but a longer and more substantial and rather virtuosic piece. And this goes along with kind of Beethoven, all throughout his life, was always tinkering with his forms and thinking about ways to make things more compact and more succinct and to kind of have fewer and fewer wasted notes. Next I will play a complete sonata. This sonata is actually quite, in some ways, it's related to what I was talking to you about this particular piece. This is the sonata I'll be doing is the 22nd of his 32 sonatas, significantly later, kind of from his middle, more mature period. And it's actually one of the most unusual sonatas, and it very, very well illustrates how Beethoven was always trying something different with his forms and trying to kind of use them to express particularly what he wanted, and also to explore different things that other composers hadn't done with these particular forms. The sonata that I'll be playing, the Opus 54, it's a two-movement piece, which is already rather unusual. And in many ways, these two movements are kind of like the equivalent of the last two movements of a typical sonata, the two lighter movements. And Beethoven kind of wanted to put a little more focus on those. Often they were almost an afterthought after the composers wrote these more substantial first movements. And so the first movement is a minuet, which was, a courtly dance of the mid-18th century. And again, usually these minuets were lighter and shorter. There'd be a contrasting middle section. The minuet would return, and that would be the end of it. In this one, Beethoven writes a minuet that, again, is a well-mannered, rather courtly dance. But it has this wonderful nostalgic quality, almost Beethoven thinking about the music of his youth, because he grew up at the court at Bonn in Germany, where his father worked and his grandfather had been like the Kapellmeister, or like the music master to the court. Even though the minuet was kind of an antique form and Beethoven was, moving on into the future, into Romanticism, he loved to kind of look back and write these very fond little minuets. So that's the beginning section. Then it's followed by a contrasting section where Beethoven was almost trying to be as different from the minuet as he possibly could. Rather than the smoothness of the minuet, this second section is kind of rough and virtuosic with these sort of modern octave passages all over going all over the piano, full of a great deal of humor. The minuet returns in a sort of ornamented form, and then he brings back that middle section one more time, but this time it's really truncated. It's interrupted almost by the minuet returning for a third time. The minuet now becomes more and more elaborate, more elaborately ornamented. It's almost, almost to the point where he might be almost poking fun at this little simple little minuet that he wrote. It comes to a little kind of cadenza passage, meaning like almost this free passage with a bunch of trills, and the music comes to a stop. It's almost sounding like what a singer might improvise in the middle of an aria or something. And then finally, at the end of this minuet, the final section has a much more intense, more romantic kind of emotional quality. And the nostalgic feeling is even more intense than it had been before. And it builds up to this kind of final sort of pulsating chord that's so not only dissonant, but it has such a yearning kind of romantic quality. It could be something that Liszt wrote. It's so sort of dramatic in a way. And so in some ways, Beethoven in this piece is looking back at the 18th century of his youth and transforming the minuet into something of his current 19th century state. The second movement is almost total opposite to this, to the minuet. It's kind of a perpetual motion, a piece in straight 16th notes the whole way through. It never stops even for a moment. Beethoven in this piece seems to be so enjoying himself in this free way, kind of modulating through every key that he possibly can. It has every kind of like strange, unusual modulation that you possibly could write. It's something that I like to kind of like bring out for my theory students and tell them, here's a challenge, try to analyze how Beethoven gets into all these different keys. And then finally, the piece at the very end, it increases tempo and brings the piece to a incredibly sort of a joyous, energetic, virtuosic ending. Next, I'd like to move on to some works by Frédéric Chopin, the great Polish composer. Chopin's works were only written, like the pieces I'll be playing are maybe 25 or 30 years after the pieces by Beethoven. And they were written really within 10 years of Beethoven's death. But they're from really a totally different era, really a totally different time and a very, very different experience. Beethoven's considered like the sort of like the bridge, the person who kind of like moved music into that sort of romantic era. But Chopin is one of the sort of central and quintessential figures of the romantic movement. The first piece that I'll be playing is his first Impromptu. This piece has got this, wonderful elegance to it. Chopin's world was the sort of the salons of Paris. I mean, Chopin was born in Poland. He had his education and upbringing there. But for someone of his talent and ability, Poland was way too much of a cultural kind of backwater of Europe at the time. And he felt that he would have to kind of move on to Vienna or maybe Paris, or he thought about London, even occurred to maybe even immigrate to America. But, he left Poland at the age of 20 and never was able to return, mostly due to the sort of political situation there. And Poland at the time was dominated by Russia and Prussia. And if Chopin were to return, he would have had to have gone to military service, which Chopin was kind of like the, what could I say, the quintessential sort of like 90-pound tubercular weakling. I mean, he would have died in the military within a week. But anyway, he first went on to Vienna, and then he went to Paris, and he immediately felt at home there. He had these sort of impeccable manners. He loved to dress in the most recent and most elegant fashions, and he fit in quite well with all the aristocratic salons. I guess the aristocrats finally found a musician who, deserved to be invited to all of their gatherings. And during these times, like all sorts of other artists and poets all gathered there, and they, shared their latest poetry and latest sculptures and art. And Chopin would at the same time play some of his latest compositions. And again, this particular Impromptu, I think, is sort of gives us the atmosphere of these elegant salons, these elegant gatherings. In the middle section of the piece, there's almost this sort of dramatic, operatic aria kind of comes in. Chopin loved opera, and even when he first left Poland, and he was spending his dad's money, he had to write an apologetic letter to him explaining why he went to operas, every day of the week and spent all of his money that way. He said that he had to kind of like see what all these other composers were doing and hear all these great singers that he hadn't had a chance to hear in Poland, which I'm sure was true. But in the middle of this piece, there's kind of like this very dramatic opera aria, and then the first section then comes back. One musical form that Chopin really is given credit for practically inventing. It was actually invented, this is the Nocturne. It was actually invented by an Irish pianist and composer by the name of John Field, but Chopin took it up and really made it his own and made it into something really, really great and substantial. I mean, essentially, it's kind of like an operatic aria, sort of translated to the piano. A very vocal melody in the right hand, and in the left hand, a somewhat repetitive accompaniment, like you would get like in an orchestral accompaniment for an aria. In the Nocturne that I will be playing, it's one of the earlier ones, the Opus 15, number 1 in F major. There is a rather repetitive accompaniment in the left hand, but the harmonies are so varied and so interesting. They kind of like morph chromatically from one to the other. It almost gives this sort of feeling of being disoriented, like what key are we in? How did we get here? And then Chopin kind of like crawls around a little bit to another harmony, and finally we feel like, okay, now we're back home. But what was this journey? It's almost like this sort of a dreamlike kind of state that he manages to evoke. The middle section is a very, very big contrast. It's stormy and dramatic, much more so than most of the majority of nocturnes. my final piece in this group of Chopin pieces, I will play his Mazurka in B flat minor, Opus 24, number 4. The Mazurkas are perhaps Chopin's most intimate pieces. He put many of his most of his sort of most intense and inward music in the Mazurkas. The Mazurka was a Polish dance, something that didn't really circulate through the rest of Europe the way that the Polonaise did. And so I think for Chopin it had sort of real connotations of his home country and his upbringing with his family. As I said, he never was able to return to Poland after he was 20, and he was very, very close with his family, and he loved his country and the culture that he grew up with. And so I think that every time he wrote a mazurka, he thought of the mazurkas that he danced as a young person growing up in Poland, and I think often put many of his most sort of intimate emotions into them. This particular mazurka has a wonderfully kind of quirky kind of dance. Mazurkas always have the accents are not on the principal beats the way they would be on a waltz. They're often on the second or third beat of a 3, and often there are these funny hesitations that are in there before some of these beats. In the middle section, there's a very, very quiet section that's just in plain octaves, and that's probably an allusion to vocal mazurkas that were sung by women's choirs. And then the very end, the piece becomes more and more almost bitter for a moment, but then it ends in a very, very kind of quiet and contemplative way. But again, almost the quietest music that one could possibly even write. Next, I'd like to offer two works by Johannes Brahms. Though Brahms is one of the great Romantic era composers, and we often think of him in the same breath with Chopin and Schumann, Mendelssohn, Liszt, and all of those. He was actually a little bit later. He was born, more than 20 years after all of those, and most of his works were written in the second half of the 19th century, whereas the majority of all those other composers, most of them, died young and wrote all of their works before about 1850. Brahms had a very, very interesting place and kind of an interesting relationship to Romanticism. The early Romantic composers kind of went away from writing in these traditional forms of, that Beethoven perfected, that Mozart and Haydn wrote in, the sonatas, symphonies, rondos, variations, all these forms that the composers had used. And there was something of a reaction among some people that there's like, what is all this weird Chopin Liszt stuff, all this virtuosity, all of these poetic forms? What about all of these things that Mozart and Haydn used to use? And Brahms had a natural propensity for those forms. And as a young man at the age of 20, he wrote several big, very, very grand, very, very fine piano sonatas. And he kind of went off to kind of like try to start his career. And first he visited Liszt. They weren't really particularly well matched in personality and their music outlook. So he left Weimar where Liszt was, and he went to visit Robert Schumann. And immediately Schumann recognized the genius of Brahms. and saw him as perhaps this person who was going to be the standard bearer of sort of traditional forms. Schumann took him into his household. Brahms lived with them for quite a while, and one of Schumann's last things that he actually did, Schumann very soon after Brahms arrived, lapsed into insanity and spent the last 2 years of his life in an insane asylum. But Schumann had written many articles of musical criticism, and his last article was introducing this great new hope for music, Johannes Brahms, and put him out there as like, he's going to be the antidote to all these very free romantics. Of course, he didn't really consult the 20-year-old Brahms about that as to like, is this really, do you want to be defined for your entire life at the age of 20 by the great Robert Schumann? But that's kind of where he found himself. And in some degree, I think, though Brahms half embraced this, but he half wanted to be somewhat free from it. He was the one of these composers who wrote all these all the symphony and sonata and typical concerto and chamber music forms. But in some ways, he was almost at his best when he wrote these sort of like intimate character pieces that are very, very similar in vein to, say, what Chopin or Liszt did, though in his very, very own way. The pieces that I'll be playing today were written in around 1892, 1893, among the last pieces that Brahms wrote. At this point in Brahms's life, he could feel sort of the winds of change around him. He could feel the 20th century coming on, those sort of winds of almost disillusionment. He could feel World War I was somewhere in the future of his country. He could feel that his musical aesthetic was sort of passing by, and modernism, exploring extremes of dissonance and tonality and sort of strange emotional states was going to be the new norm. Several years before, he had actually decided to retire from composing, stating that he really had nothing more to say, that he was tired of putting his stuff out there and people weren't understanding it anyway, and so he was going to retire. Though, of course, he probably kept that resolution up for a few weeks and then started composing again. And these last pieces were written for no reason other than he just felt like writing them for himself. They're incredibly sort of intimate views into his feelings and his life. When each time after he finished composing them, he sent them to his dear friend Clara Schumann, Robert Schumann's wife, and Brahms and Clara had become great friends for the rest of both of their lives. He would send them to her and ask her to play them, but tell her that perhaps one listener is too many. Well, I forgot to mention this is the Intermezzos, Opus 119, number 2 and number 3. That the first one is a rather wide-ranging, serious, occasionally has almost an anxious quality at times, with a very, very beautiful, almost schmaltzy middle section that kind of, you can feel the ease and fun of Viennese life at the time. And the second one, Brahms' music is often rather, serious, and this is one of his relatively less common attempts at writing a lighter, sort of wonderfully humorous and melodic piece. It's wonderfully varied and virtuosic and really quite dashing and unusual in his works. For my final set of pieces, I'd like to offer two pieces by Franz Liszt. The first is an etude entitled Chasse. That I guess loosely could be translated as snow chase or snow swirls. It's a wonderful evocation of the quiet and the calm that you get during a snowfall. And then the music gradually builds up with these sort of increasing tremolos and all these chromatic scales in the bass, like, sounding like wind coming in a winter storm, and things get very, very dramatic. And at the very end, everything kind of gradually kind of calms down again and returns to the mood of the beginning. It's from a set of etudes called the 12 Transcendental Etudes. Etudes originally were just basically piano exercises. In the early 19th century, the piano was becoming more and more popular as an instrument. More and more people were buying them and having to learn how to play them. And then composers had a sort of a minor industry in writing little exercises to help people learn various branches of piano playing, scales, arpeggios, octaves, chords. Chopin wrote 2 books of etudes, and his etudes actually, not only are they great for the fingers, but they also turn out that they're really, really great pieces of music too. Liszt decided to emulate what Chopin did, and he wrote his even bigger and more grand set of transcendental etudes. In some ways, these are etudes like, okay, you have to have such mastery of the piano to kind of play these. You have to they're almost etudes in pianistic expression, like they're incredibly wide varying in what types of moods and types of atmosphere that they can evoke. So it's almost like putting all of this these technical piano things in the service of making great musical statements. Liszt was sort of like the almost maybe the greatest pianist ever, the person who we could see how the first piece of Beethoven that I played, written in 1797, by the time it was 1836, 37, 38, that just a scant 40 years later, when Liszt was writing these etudes, you could see how much piano playing had evolved. Chopin added a great deal of it, many, many, many dimensions, and then Liszt endeavored to kind of fill in everything that everyone hadn't done at the time. And essentially there really wasn't much added in piano technique, forever after that. Almost everyone else just like took a branch of what Liszt had developed and said, okay, I'll go a little further with this, but pretty much they owed everything to Liszt. And this Chasse is the final one of those etudes. They'll follow that with the great Vallee Dobermann. This piece is from a set of pieces that's entitled The Years of Pilgrimage. It's from the first volume, which is based on Swiss things, Swiss stories, Swiss nature, and all of that. Liszt had an incredible life, something that like a novelist couldn't make up. He would have been kind of the person who had been in all the gossip pages of all today's papers. Everyone would be talking about him constantly. When he was 23, he met a married countess who was separated from her husband and independently wealthy and could do whatever she wanted. They fell in love with each other, and they decided to kind of escape the gossiping in Paris. They decided they would run away to Switzerland and Italy and take in the sights of Switzerland and see all the art and history that is in Italy. And, their romantic adventure lasted a few years. Of course, as soon as they got there, the Countess came down with a bad toothache and then hurt her leg, and it wasn't quite this idyllic romantic adventure they both wanted, but again, it kind of... it lasted, and they did get to kind of experience Switzerland and Italy. But one of the important things that came out of this were Liszt wrote a series of pieces that were impressions of what they saw in each of these countries. And the Vallee Dobermann is kind of like inspired by the awe-inspiring scenery of the Swiss Alps. Vallee, Obermann was actually it actually is referring to a novel that was written by a rather obscure, now obscure writer by the name of Etienne de Senancourt. He wrote a novel entitled Obermann that was very, very popular among the early Romantic generation, Liszt and his circle. It was sort of about someone who was a hermit and lived in a valley in the Swiss Alps. And it was written in a series of letters to his friends. And I think this is Liszt imagining that he had discovered Obermann's Valley. And during this time, I guess the music kind of evolves from this almost like dark, almost like, stuck in a kind of, I won't say it's not a bored state, but a state where, that you just can't escape from. Everything's going kind of around in circles, a feeling of almost depression or despair. And the music gradually becomes lighter and lighter. There is a sort of a storm comes up in the middle, I guess a Swiss alpine storm. And at the end, it ends in this sort of like transcendent, joyous, transcendent, incredibly grand music that's probably inspired by what he saw in the Alps. wrap up my performance this afternoon, evening, or morning, or however you have it, I would like to play a brief little encore. It's the Barcarolle, Opus 65, number 6, by Charles Alkan, a 19th century French composer who was a contemporary and friend of both Chopin and Liszt.